Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible, both from Milligan College, as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for the day. Now, here is Dr. Gwaltney.
Good morning and welcome to In the Word. We're so glad you have joined us today. We continue in our theme of acknowledging God and looking at the characteristics of God from Old Testament viewpoint and from also the New Testament viewpoint. And so we are going to be talking about bringing first fruits.
First fruits, a very important concept, both in the Old and New Testament.
I'm glad to hear you say that. So we have, somebody might wonder, what in the world are we talking about? First fruits.
Well, if you're a gardener, then you know how to appreciate first fruits, because there's nothing better than the first meal of sweet corn. You know, the first picking of corn, that first time, that's good.
So you're
the first mess of beans out of the garden.
You're
right?
Big on corn and beans, huh?
I am. Yeah, so first fruits, it's very, very, very important. And this lesson follows up well on last week's lesson, which was about an offering, a very different kind of offering.
Yes.
The offering related to the temple, to the tabernacle, the building of the tabernacle. And here we have something that's more part of their regular life and yearly worship cycle.
Yes.
But at any rate, we're still in the concept of giving to the Lord.
Well, that's the unusual thing. The unusual thing here in this first fruits law, and it is law from their perspective, is that you can't eat your corn and beans until you make a contribution of corn and beans at the worship center, and so that part of it, the first part of it, goes to God and to God's priests.
Yeah.
Now that I don't know if you do that or not.
No, that's a little different from me eating the first ears of corn and me eating the first mess of beans. Yeah, you're right about that.
That's true.
You had briefly mentioned last week something I think that bears repeating, and that is that the first 5 books of the Old Testament, what they called the Torah, we sometimes call the Pentateuch, kind of go chronologically, and we kind of read them chronologically from the beginning up through their arrival at the border of the Promised Land.
Yeah.
But the way ancient people looked at a series did not go in a straight line forward. It tended to turn back toward the middle, which was the center of significance for them, right?
Kind of like the mirror image effect.
Yeah.
And we call that a chiasm because of the Greek letter chi.
It looks like an X, but
it's like an X.
They called it a chi, and it's a CH sound. At any rate, the point of intersection becomes the point of significance for them.
Yes.
Not the beginning and not the end. If that's the case, which we think it was for ancient people, Leviticus is right at the heart of the Torah.
Yes.
And so this book, which is about the worship of God, is at the heart of everything they're talking about through these first 5 books.
And for many of us, this is probably the most boring book of the 5.
It is. It's hard, especially those first 7 chapters. They're hard to slog through.
Yes. I mean, all the rules and regs for different kinds of sacrifices and what each one is supposed to accomplish.
Right. But what we need to remind ourselves of is that the centrality of worship in their lives. I mean, that tabernacle was right in the center of their camp.
Yes.
So it was physically in the center.
Physically, yes.
But then spiritually, it was the center of their lives, and it's the center of the Torah as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And most people don't realize this centrality principle and how important all of this was to the Jewish people in Old Testament times, and then even when we come to the time of Jesus and thereafter, the Pharisees were the great scholars of the study of the Torah and related writings, and they sought to find the will of God for them in the secrets that are to be found there, and so they argued for centuries over the meanings of not only words but even parts of words that are included, in the sacred text, and because they felt like God was speaking to them in the written word, as well as in the traditional word. To them, God had given them His will in two forms. That is, the Torah in writing and the Torah which was upon the lips, which is actually, tradition. Yeah. Which we hear about in Fiddler on the Roof.
You're not going to start singing
No,
Fiddler on the Roof.
No.
Good. Whew, that was a close one.
That was a close call.
Now, Leviticus begins with a reference to 5 different kinds of sacrifices. The one that is most central to our study today is the grain offering, sometimes called cereal offering.
Yes.
But there was also the burnt offering.
Yeah.
Then the grain offering, then a fellowship offering, which we mentioned recently.
Yes.
And then 2 related to wrongdoing at the end.
Sin and
guilt.
Guilt.
Yeah. So this is mainly, we're concerned about the grain offering today.
I would hate to have been a priest, and because the priest's duties did not stop with knowing all the rules and regs about these 5 different kinds of sacrifices and offerings. They also had to know a whole lot about skin lesions and one thing and another like that. So they had to know how to discern the will of God in the form of various kinds of omen interpretations.
Oh yeah.
What a priest had to know it was monstrous what they had to know.
Now, part of our lesson today is of an actual feast of first fruits, or a festival of first fruits.
Yes.
And that occurred in association with Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread at the spring barley harvest.
Right. They would plant the fields with the cereal grains, and there were 2 main cereal grains, barley and wheat. And barley would come ripe first, generally in maybe April, something like that. And then the wheat would come along about 50 days later.
So we're around the time of Passover, which puts it around our Easter time.
Yeah, now Passover has more the character of a pastoralist celebration. And that would celebrate probably the lambing season or something like that. In other words, it was a festival focused on that lifestyle.
But first fruits is more of a harvest festival.
And it comes in the time of unleavened bread. And that unleavened bread is a 7-day celebration of the cereal
the barley harvest.
The barley
Yeah.
harvest.
Well, good.
And then, about 50 days later, then would be the wheat harvest.
And that's Pentecost.
Pentecost.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's read about this first fruits here. We'll have one verse out of chapter 2 and then jump down to Leviticus chapter 23. If you bring a grain offering of first fruits to the Lord, offer crushed heads of new grain roasted in the fire. Now down to Leviticus 23:9. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I'm going to give you, and you reap its harvest, bring to the priest a sheaf of the first grain you harvest. He is to wave the sheaf before the Lord, so it will be accepted on your behalf. The priest is to wave it on the day after the Sabbath. On the day you wave the sheaf, you must sacrifice as a burnt offering to the Lord a lamb, a year old, without defect, together with its grain offering of 2/10 of an ephah of the finest flour, mixed with olive oil, a food offering presented to the Lord, a pleasing aroma, and its drink offering of 1/4 of a hin of wine. You must not eat any bread or roasted or new grain until the very day you bring this offering to your God. This is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come, wherever you live." Now we skip down to verse 22. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and for the foreigner residing among you. I am the Lord your God.
Well, there's several things to be said here, and we need to go back up to verse 11, and notice that this is postponed in verse 10. It's postponed until they enter the land.
These instructions were given during their years in the Sinai wilderness.
Yes.
When they aren't planting crops.
Right.
So these are instructions for once they get to the promised land, when they settle down and start planting vegetable crops.
Okay, now to review the wave offering, it's not like, hi there.
Right.
It's a formal act by which ownership of the sheaf is transferred from the farmer who grew it to the priest who is going to benefit from it. And it's given to the priest. The priest passes it in a horizontal waving like so, then followed by a vertical waving like so, and then the priest, by that method, takes possession of it in behalf of God, and then it is then devoted to the feeding of the priests and the priestly families.
Okay, so that's the beginning of the offering of first fruits, this first sheaf of wheat that would be cut from the barley field.
Right.
But it's just the first of a rather complex formula here for offering, because it's followed by a burnt offering. And this is
by several offerings.
The next thing, though, immediately you offer a burnt offering, which is an animal sacrifice.
Yes.
And we're told here a lamb, year old without defect, is to be offered to the Lord on the altar of burnt offering.
And then you have a grain offering of 2/10 of an ephah.
About how big are we talking there?
Okay, now a full ephah would be 21 quarts, dry measure.
That's a lot.
That is
quarts.
well, the full ephah would be, but 2/10 of it would be less.
A fifth be about 4 quarts.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then you have, after that,
there's a drink offering mentioned at the end of verse 13.
By the way, this 2/10 of an ephah is of flour from the barley.
Okay.
And it's,
whereas before we had the actual sheaf of barley, the stalks with the barley grains on it.
Right.
Okay.
And then you have it's mixed with olive oil, and this is the normal way of mixing it. And the interesting thing is that there can be no leavening in it. So this is going to be unleavened bread.
So this isn't just flour. This is flour mixed with oil, so it's kind of a cake.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And
the drink offering is wine. How much wine are we talking about here?
Well, a heen, or you can pronounce it hin or a heen, is actually about a gallon. So a quarter of a heen would be about a quart.
A liter or a quart. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good bit of wine.
And by the way, I should stop and say that wine was very expensive because it was rare in Palestine. And in fact, when you drank wine, you never drank wine full-bodied. You always would cut it with water. So it would be 2 parts water and 1 part wine. And that was not because of their concern about...
this isn't a drunkenness issue or alcoholism or anything like that.
That wasn't the issue.
No.
The issue is that the cost of it and the rarity of a wine. So
So this is really a very complex ceremony with the waving of a sheaf of barley grain, then a burnt offering of a lamb, then another grain offering of flour mixed with oil, and then finally a drink offering of wine.
Yes.
So very, very complex. It's clear, though, throughout that this is all to God.
Yes.
In verse 11, you wave it before the Lord. And in verse 13, it's presented to the Lord. And in verse 14, it's an offering to God.
You're right.
So over and over again,
the emphasis,
God is the focus.
You're right. Even though the clergy may be consuming it, part of it can be used for the normal, ongoing sacrificial system.
Yeah.
See, they had 2 sacrifices per day that they had to keep up, one in the morning and one in the late afternoon. And so they had to have something to keep those ceremonies. It's very interesting to me that throughout antiquity, and this is not just the Israelites here, but also even pagan religions, saw that the main act of worshiping before a deity involved feeding a meal, in other words.
Yeah.
And sometimes you're feeding the god, sometimes you're feeding the god and the clergy, and sometimes you're involved in what sounds like a communion kind of meal in which you, the God, and the clergy are all participating in a meal at the same time.
Yeah. You know, speaking of communion, I felt a little foreshadowing here of Christian communion, the Lord's Supper,
Yes.
because you've got an offering of grain, or that is flour, bread,
Yes.
and then you've got an offering of wine. So there's a little bit of suggestion of communion there to me.
There's an interesting, I think, interesting detail that's kind of like buried in the situation here, because what is, it's not the chaff that you prepare bread out of. It's the kernel of the wheat.
Right.
And what you're doing is you are taking it and crushing it and grinding it and then mixing some liquid with it. In this case, it's olive oil, and you're even putting maybe some frankincense or other
spices.
Yeah, some sort of spice with it, and eating it. And what you do that, when you do that to that grain, you have thereby caused the grain to sacrifice its very purpose for existence.
Yeah, it can no longer be used as seed for...
It's no longer seed.
Right, it's now...
To grow more grain.
It's been crushed.
It's been crushed.
Yeah.
It's been sacrificed.
Yeah.
And so that's always in a meal, it involves a sacrifice.
You could say the same thing about wine. The grapes have been crushed.
Yes, that's right.
You could, yeah, that's interesting. Well, let's say a word to us about this phrase, a pleasing aroma. Now, God is not a human being. God doesn't have a nose. Or, you know, what is the, what should we
he sits on a throne. What does he sit on?
Well, I think that's symbolic, but at any rate, we won't argue over that. What do you think the purpose of the pleasing aroma? What's the significance of that idea?
Well, I tell you, there are in town some restaurants I love to go by because they are admitting a pleasing odor.
It gives you delight to drive by those places.
We used to have a bakery in town where we could drive by and smell those wonderful aromas.
So it's pleasing to the Lord, right? It's pleasing.
Well, you know, we call these anthropomorphisms.
Where we use human categories to describe God.
That's right. I mean, how else can you talk about God if you don't use human similarities?
Yeah. But I think it's interesting to think about God being delighted by our sacrifices in his behalf.
Right.
Being pleased by that.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, good. Now, they have added to our lesson an interesting verse down near the end of the chapter, after skipping over some verses 15 through 21.
And I made a note here, they really deal with the next big festival, which is the Festival of Weeks, which celebrates the wheat harvest.
Okay, and we are familiar with that in the New Testament as Pentecost.
Yes, it's called Pentecost.
And that came late May, early June.
Right.
Later in the spring.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Late spring, early summer.
So we're skipping that in order to get this fascinating passage about how you are to reap the harvest. And it says, you don't reap to the very edges of the field, and you don't
gather the gleanings.
Gather the gleanings.
Now, what are the gleanings?
Yeah, well, in the harvesting, when you would take a bundle of wheat stalks or barley stalks and hit it with a scythe or sickle,
yes,
inevitably there'd be some shaking and some of the grains would fall to the ground.
Yeah, right.
If it's ripe, then some will fall. Well, you might want to be really thorough and pick up those grains, but the law says no, don't pick up any grains that fall to the ground. Allow the poor and foreigners, immigrants, aliens, to come onto your field after it's done. And not only gleaning, but they weren't even allowed to harvest the edges of the field and the corners of the field.
Right.
Oh, I watched my father, cut hay and wheat, and he would take his tractor, and of course you can't drive right into a corner. He would curve, but then he would back up to make sure he cut that corner down. He didn't want to miss a thing. But they were commanded to miss it back here.
So that was their way of providing something for these people that did not have food otherwise.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me that this provision is in the law and repeated many times, not only for the Israelite poor, but also for the non-Israelite traveler who didn't have a means of food production.
Right.
And
the resident alien, as we like to refer to them.
Yeah, that's a phrase that comes up in 1 Peter in the New Testament.
Right.
Yeah. And this is part of God's will. This isn't just some social program. That verse ends with the words, I am the Lord your God, meaning this is who I am, this is my will for you to care for the poor and the needy for whatever reason.
This is also a catch term I am Yahweh. You see that by the Lord in all capitals. Your God. And there is thus a big collection of chapters 17 through 26 of Leviticus that are referred to as the covenant code and the holiness
code
and of the covenant, and this is the reoccurring statement. You shall be holy, for I, Yahweh, your God, am holy. In other words, this is a call for human beings to try to emulate the holiness and the goodness of God. Sometimes we don't make it, but if we don't try, we never will.
And emulating the holiness of God means caring about what God cares about. It means caring
the poor.
It means caring for those whom God cares about.
Exactly.
And so that's brought out beautifully here. Before we run out of time, I wanted to mention the fact that this concept of first fruits turns up again in the New Testament in two fascinating ways. The first way is in a description of Jesus. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, which is all about the resurrection.
Yeah, right. The great resurrection chapter.
It's in two sections. The first part is about the resurrection of Jesus. The second part is about the resurrection of Christ's followers.
Yes.
And 3 times in that chapter, it calls Jesus the first fruits from the dead, meaning that Jesus' resurrection from the dead was just like that first sheaf of wheat that's cut was anticipation of a great harvest yet to come.
It's given to God.
Yeah. Here, the resurrection of Jesus is like a first fruits of a great resurrection of his followers that is yet to come.
The other resurrection, the resurrection for us, must await the resurrection of the first fruits
of Christ. Yes. And then the other way, the phrase is used in the New Testament is to refer to Christians. There's this beautiful verse in 2 Thessalonians where Paul writes these words, "But we must always give thanks to God for you, brothers and sisters, beloved by the Lord, because God chose you as the first fruits for salvation through sanctification by the Spirit and through belief in the truth." He's saying that you Christians are the first fruits. God is bringing many more people to faith and to salvation through faith in Jesus Christ.
And they were not exactly the first in Europe.
No, but they were among the first.
Among the first.
Among the first. Yeah, that's true. So, Jesus our Lord is the first fruits of the resurrection, and we are the first fruits of salvation.
That's right. And bringing the first fruits is a sign of giving to God the honor and glory that he is due for the harvest, whatever kind of harvest it happens to be.
Yeah, good.
We're so glad you could be with us. This is kind of an interesting subject that we've been dealing with here this morning. Probably some things that you didn't expect to hear about, and we're glad you could be with us. And we'll continue with this theme then again next week, and we trust you will be with us on In the Word.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson with Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible for Milligan College, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible of Milligan College. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of the First Christian Church Television Ministries.